Welcome to another exciting episode of the Business of Digital podcast, featuring your hosts, Matt Siltala and Dave Rohr. Hey guys, excited for another one of these Business of Digital podcasts. We have a couple special guests with us. I'd like to just kind of give a virtual wave and shout to Elmer Boutin and Steven Cernak. Hey guys, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, no problem. Also, we do have Dave there in the background somewhere. Hey, Dave.
Somewhere.
But this was one that's been, this episode's been a little bit in the making, and we've been trying to get together to discuss, some fun Google antitrust stuff. And so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of pass the reins a little bit to Dave, and Dave's going to get us started on today's episode. And hopefully when it comes to this topic, we're gonna all be enlightened a little bit more. And so again, I appreciate everybody joining us and being on the episode today. So, Dave.
Well, thank you, sir. I'll let you guys introduce yourself a bit and give your. I'm sure, Stephen, you have to give a bit of a disclaimer, especially since you are a lawyer. Elmer, you are not.
Definitely not.
Definitely not. Yeah, neither are we. We are not accountants and lawyers, as we say in lots of shows. So please talk to your accountant or lawyer as needed. But I'll let you guys give a bit of background about yourself as well.
Yeah.
So
if it's okay, I'll go ahead and get us started. So Steve and I went to grade school together. That's how we met. And so we've known each other on and off throughout the years. After high school, as typically happens, you fall out of contact with people. But we, I guess several months ago, maybe a year ago, we reconnected on LinkedIn and started seeing a lot of interesting articles about Google and antitrust and the stuff that was going on in Europe, and then how the United States has not sought to pursue Google from an antitrust perspective. And then I noticed, hey, Steve's an antitrust attorney. He'd be a really good person to ask about this. So I started sharing some articles with him and getting his perspective. And then we went and had lunch one day where he gave me a very good lame-term person's explanation of antitrust and how it works in the United States, which I thought was pretty fascinating considering I knew nothing about it. As you said, we're not attorneys. He is, though, so he's got a great understanding of it, had a great explanation, and I thought, man, this would be a perfect podcast episode for you two because this is something that a lot of people talk about. Google's big, they dominate search, they dominate so many other areas. Why are they not considered a monopoly? So that's why I worked to try to get Steve in here so we could discuss this with someone who knows what they're talking about.
And we're grateful to you that you did. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. This is Steve Cernak, and yes, I am a lawyer, and so that means that I do need to start off with a little bit of a disclaimer. I work for a law firm by the name of Schiff Harden. I'm in the Ann Arbor office. Everything I say will be my own views, not necessarily the views of anybody else at the firm or any of our clients or anybody else. We do not do any work for Google, but obviously we do work for people that are active in the social media world because everybody's active in the social media world. I have been an antitrust lawyer since I came out of law school, came out of the University of Michigan. I worked for 20 plus years as an antitrust lawyer for General Motors in Detroit. Now I've been here at the Schiff Harden Law Firm for over 6 years now. And I also end up teaching antitrust at a few different law schools, and currently the University of Michigan Law School, but also on a regular basis at the Western Michigan Cooley Law School here in the Detroit area as well, and I'm active in the American Bar Association section of antitrust law. So I live for antitrust. I do an awful lot of antitrust. I bore my 3 sons to tears talking about antitrust, so it's something that I do. And I guess the only other thing that I would mention, and Dave, I think this was you who put it up here, the one thing that I tell my students, first class and last class, there's no hyphen in antitrust. That's the old-fashioned way of saying it, and if you put a hyphen in, that's an indication that you do not know what you're talking about. So you want to make sure that if you get nothing else out of this podcast, you take the hyphen out of antitrust, because then you'll at least sound or look a little smarter.
Well, that's funny because yeah, if I typed in a space, the system that we use to record automatically puts it in there.
Yeah, no, well, then the system's wrong. It's all one word, no hyphen.
No, I typed it in wrong. I shouldn't have had no space. So I think you kind of already touched on a little bit, but I think the antitrust competition kind of law 101.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we were to start with what it is, especially a lot of us that, love Google, but we also hate Google. And there's probably people that really hate Google depending on the day and, scream about, that it's got too much power. Let's take a big step back and talk about what antitrust looks like over in the EU, which
Mm-hmm.
is, as we all know, a little crazy sometimes. But they also do some things probably a little bit better than we do over here, and then talk about how the US is different.
Okay.
Does that make sense to start? Or,
Yeah.
if not, feel free
no.
to correct me.
No, I think that makes a great deal of sense. Let's start at a high level. Antitrust law, which is what we call it here in the U.S., or competition law, which is what they call it in Europe and pretty much every other jurisdiction in the globe, around the globe that has these kinds of laws. It has a couple of different aspects to it. First, it goes after anti-competitive agreements. Think of that as price-fixing agreements. That's not what we're worried about today. But then it also goes after bad actions by big companies. But you notice that there are two steps to that latter point. That is, whether you're in the United States or in Europe or anywhere else, just being a large company, whether absolutely large or even relatively large, with a large market share, that's not an antitrust problem. That's not a competition law problem. Competition law expects companies to compete really hard, and if a company builds a better mousetrap and the world beats a path to its door and they gain large market share, that's great. That's great from a competition law standpoint. That's not a problem. That just gets them to be really large. It's then only when they take certain bad actions that it gets to be a competition law problem or an antitrust problem. So over in the EU, the definition of really large is they are a dominant actor. So think of that as having a really large market share. But again, that's not enough. Even dominant actors are expected to compete and compete hard. But if they abuse their dominance, that's when a dominant actor can get in trouble over in Europe. In the United States, we have a similar sort of two-step process. We use different words. We call the big companies a monopolist. Not quite 100% of the market is necessary in order to be a monopolist. It can be 60, 70, 80%, but it still has to be a large market share. And then we say that the bad actions are monopolizing, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but it's the same sort of idea. They're taking bad actions, and they're big actors taking bad actions, and that's why they get into antitrust or competition law trouble.
And that was something that really struck me when we had lunch that one day, Steve. It was the fact that it's not enough that they're big and dominant, which Google is obviously in the search market and in a lot of many other businesses, but it's that bad act that you mentioned. For example, there's no one stopping someone else from building a better search engine. Bing certainly, Microsoft certainly is with Bing. There are many other search engines out there, some of which are dominant in other parts of the world. And I think that's what really kind of piqued my interest in it was, the fact that they have to be actively doing something in order to get into trouble here in the United States.
Yeah, and even in Europe, they have to be doing something in order to get into trouble over in Europe. A slight difference between the U.S. and Europe in that in Europe, the something bad can be what's called exploitative. That is, think of it as they're charging too much money or they're otherwise exploiting their dominant position. But what we're really talking about here, both in Europe with Google, but also these are the same kind of bad acts in the United States, would be exclusionary acts. That is, they're doing something to exclude their competitors, to make it more difficult for their competitors to compete. That is, they're doing something to maintain their monopoly or to, maintain their dominant position, something other than, continuing to build an even better mousetrap that customers will really like.
Yep, helps to unmute. Yeah, I'm just thinking of all and Elmer, back when I worked at the large agency with the Fortune 50, it's always someone saying that, Google is keeping us down because of whatever, especially the large.
Yeah.
I think.
And you see a lot of that too, Dave. It's not just the big companies, right? It's the little guys too. And I get where they're coming from sometimes, but when I'm looking at, for example, we're looking at answer boxes or other types of things that may prevent Google's users from clicking through to a website. And I've heard several people, and right or wrong, their opinion is that there's always been this tacit agreement that if we optimize our websites according to best practices, that Google in turn would send traffic to us. And I don't think that was ever there. And in the research that I've done, when I've looked at that stuff, I've always seen that Google has been very clear that they want to provide answers to their users as quickly as possible.
Which Elmer, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
But it made me think about, like, one of the big examples that's always used is like the temperature, and it's funny because like you don't even have to wait for a no box to even come up anymore. As you're typing it up in the search bar, what is the temperature, and then it automatically pops up 66 degrees based on where you're at, and so like I don't even have to wait for that result. Like as a user, I love that. If I'm weather.com, I probably don't like that, but I just think it's interesting how like what we've talked. There's this talk about the zero result or the no result. The knowledge box or whatever. What happens in a case like that where you're not even finishing typing in the actual search itself, and it pops up the information that you need. Anyway, sorry. I just thought I'd throw that out there. I thought it was interesting.
No, and I think that comes into the discussion here. Could that be considered a bad act where Google's dominating the information? From my perspective, I'm telling the clients that I work with and small businesses that I counsel with, not in an attorney sense, of course, that winning in search is very, very different in 2018 than it was in 2008, and it's been evolving like that. And so that was another thing that kind of sparked my interest in chatting with Steve about this was, understanding what does that bad act need to look like? And, what is it that causes someone to cross the line other than, us in the search industry squawking about it or, somebody in Congress saying, hey, you're doing this wrong.
And Matt's example, I think, is very interesting. Because the standard is really supposed to be what's the effect on the ultimate consumer? At least as antitrust law and competition law is interpreted today, the effect on the ultimate consumer is supposed to be what we're focused on. And so, as a consumer, if you want to know the temperature, it's easier if you start typing it and the answer suddenly pops up even before you finish. Gosh, isn't that better in various ways for the consumer, for the ultimate consumer? And yet, the other competitors out there, whether it's weather.com or Weather Underground or whatever, feel like they've been excluded because of that. They don't get a chance to even touch the consumer because the consumer's not going to go to Weather Underground because they've already got the answer that they were looking for. That's the sort of thing that that the EU is looking at in the Google shopping case from 2017. If you would type something into the search box, you would get a product that you might want to buy. You would get Google's comparison shopping site right away. You would not get some other website's answer right away. That got demoted down to the third, fourth, fifth God knows what page, and of course nobody ever goes that far. Google's response was, well, yeah, but that's what customers are looking for, and the EU's reaction was, yeah, but you've excluded the other websites that could be competing with you, and that is eventually going to cause problems for consumers. And therefore, Google, you have to stop doing that, and you have to pay a large fine. That case is still on appeal. It's still not going to be done for a number of years, but that's where we stand now.
Plus, I was just thinking about this while you're talking about that, Steve, is I would hate to see a SERP result where it's, because you go to 3 different places and it'll give you 3 different temperatures, but I'd hate to be typing it in the search bar and then all of a sudden I get the Google result that's popping up wherever they're pulling it from, and then I get like the weather.com one, and then I get another one. I get like, it becomes all muddied, and it's like, who do I trust or who do I know? Anyway, it made me think of how it could end up being like, all right, well, what they're creating in here in these instant results is essentially what was a page, and it's like, is this really better? Anyway, it's just a thought.
Yeah, no, and this kind of issue is really age old from an antitrust standpoint. You can go back a few more years, and when Microsoft was in the antitrust crosshairs, one of the big issues was that they had tied together the operating system along with the browser, and therefore made it very difficult, especially back in the early 2000s, for the Netscape browser to get any traction whatsoever. And yet, one of Microsoft's defenses at that point was, but we've made a better user experience because we've technically put together the operating system and the browser. And so that was an issue here in the U.S. and in the EU for a lot of years.
Yeah, that's a matter of opinion, though, because there's a lot of people that never liked Internet Explorer. I've not used their new Edge browser, but Chrome is now the dominant browser anyway. So, and that case likely paved the way for Chrome to come into dominance.
It certainly kept it open. That's true, and I think it raised the issue about whether you wanted to continue to use the browser or wanted that Microsoft had put on the computer. But I think also technical developments made it a lot easier for not just technical experts, but people, well, I would say like you and me, but you guys are all technical experts. For people like me, to download your own browser, to have multiple browsers on the computer, as compared to 15 years ago when that was too confusing for most PC users.
So let's jump in. Excuse me. Great timing on unmuting as I try to not cough. Do you have another good example that would be a good comparison? I know we talked about the shopping one a little bit.
Well, the most recent Google case is coming out again out of the EU, and it's just this past summer 2018. And because the way the EU operates, we don't have a full opinion or decision yet. We just have the press release. But here, this is the Android case as compared to the shopping case. Here, again, Google is found by the EU to be dominant in search, but also in licensable mobile operating systems. So if you define the market that way, I think you'd define away the iOS, and Google App Stores. And here, the abuse, the bad acts, include requiring phone makers to pre-install Google Search and Chrome browsers in order to install the Google App Play Store, and also requiring that those makers who install the Google App Play Store only sell Google-approved Android phones. That is, that they were trying to prevent so-called Android forks. So again, the allegations are that Google is dominant in search. Okay, so that's where they're dominant, and then they're taking these bad acts in order to sort of leverage that dominance into other markets. But it's those bad acts that are getting them into trouble. And again, that case is really just at the beginning, and it'll be going on for years.
All right.
Go ahead, Elmer.
Well, because that's an interesting one too. And what's interesting though is that if you look at iOS, as the counterpoint of Android, I mean, they're far more locked down than I think that Android is. You can go and download the Amazon Play Store, or whatever they call it. You can download Android apps off of Amazon. You can use other distributions in order to get apps for Android. I mean, my wife has an Android phone and an Android tablet, and I see the different things that she does with hers, and then she makes fun of me because whatever she's playing and I want to join in on it, I can't find it because iOS doesn't have it yet, or they never will. So it's kind of interesting that they go, because Android is so dominant, that they seem to be more of a target than perhaps Apple, who arguably could be said to be even more locked down.
Yeah, no, and I think that, and again, I think you are articulating some of the defenses that Google has made over in Europe that to date have not quite been successful, and that is, we're trying to expand the universe. We are allowing people, Android is open source and all, but we also want to make sure that the consumer's experience is a good one. And so if you are going to use the Android system, we want to make sure that it works, that the Android system and the Google Apps Play Store work together on the phone, because we don't want consumers to have a bad experience with an Android phone and say, I'm going to go buy an Apple iPhone instead. In a sense, Google is trying to protect the consumer. At least that's their defense. And yet the way that they are doing that is arguably excluding competition from other potential Google competitors.
And I just did some quick digging, just as people go, well, what does search dominance look like right now? And just using Stat Counter Global Stats, so I'm sure everyone can go and look at a different source. It's saying that Google has about 86-87% of the search. Yahoo has 6.7 and Bing has 5.5, which honestly it seems weird. Worldwide, Google is 92.3, and then Bing, Yahoo, Baidu are all like 2 to 1%, and that's worldwide. And then just in the EU, Google actually is stronger than here in the US at 93.4, so 93.5. And then Yandex at 2.3, and then Bing, and then Yahoo, and then DuckDuckGo. So it's just interesting that they are actually stronger, and not that it has anything to do with the way the laws are, but they do have a bit more dominance over there than they even do here.
Well, and Google has not accepted that they are dominant. They have at least pushed back on that by saying, as we've all heard, that competition is only a click away. And normally when you think of a dominant actor or somebody who's a monopolist, you think about somebody who has the ability to act in a way without regard to what their competitors will do. And usually that means that they can raise their prices whenever they want in order to make more money, and they don't worry about whether their customers will go to one of their competitors. But of course, search is free. How does that work? How does this explanation of what a dominant actor is, how does that work when the price is already set at zero? I mean, that's an interesting question in the antitrust world that we haven't had a final answer on, but it's something that's getting debated on both sides of the Atlantic.
Well, that's a good point, Steve. But then on the other side of it, you look at paid search, because if Google is dominant, I mean, Dave just spat out some pretty interesting and pretty overwhelming statistics. That means for the paid search world that they're also dominant, and that does cost money. Yep. Now, granted, it is a bid system where it's more auction based, and there's certain pieces of it that may influence the price one way or the other. For example, if I'm buying a keyword and my website is more appropriate or more consumer focused to that particular term, then I would pay less than someone else, for example. But still, that's a lot of money that Google's making. You brought up I can't remember what the fine was there in Europe, but I mean, shoot, that's a drop in a bucket to Google.
Yeah, Google Shopping was 2.7 billion. I forget what it was here for Google Android, but again, I think it was over 2 billion U.S. dollars. What I'm talking about, I've converted it already.
So I think, Steve, another question I would have is, do you think the U.S. is going to start clamping down on Google and Facebook's and, I don't even think about Twitter, but Elmer, maybe or Matt, but I think between Google and Facebook, they now control like 60 to 80% of all like digital advertising. And I think it's probably even higher than that 80%. And then after them is a small growing is Amazon. And then way down the line is, someone else. But I mean, those two alone control most of the digital spend at this point.
Right. And to answer your question, I think that, well, certainly Google and Facebook and Amazon are facing government investigations, some of which we might know about, some of which we might not know about, and the possibility of private lawsuits, which are easier to bring here in the United States than they are in most jurisdictions in the EU as well. And yes, the market for online advertising seems to be one that is in the crosshairs here in the United States. And so, yes, I would expect to see some more efforts regarding online advertising. But again, assuming that we're not talking about an agreement between Facebook and Google, so we're only worried about whether they're dominant or not.
Yep.
The first step would be, well, are they really a monopolist? And we've talked about that a lot. But then, what actions are they taking at this point in order to maintain that monopoly that are anti-competitive, that are contrary to the consumer welfare? There's been a lot of talk in the last, 6-12 months about their alleged monopoly on data. So that data is the real source of this monopoly. The fact that they know so much about us, whether it's search or where we are and everything else, that means that they really are dominant, that other companies cannot break in because they don't have the access to that kind of data. Does that mean that they must provide access to that data to their competitors? Does that mean that they must provide access to our data back to us so that we can take it and port it over to somebody else that could be a potential competitor? Those are the questions that are being debated in the press, amongst antitrust experts, but also in Congress. I think you'll see that play out in lots of different arenas, whether it's in an antitrust investigation or even some changes in the law to try to increase the amount of competition that's in this space.
I think, and Elmer, Matt, you guys can jump in. I think Facebook will not get in trouble for that type of stuff, especially as I think through the way you describe it here in the US and EU. I think Facebook just has a dominance because of the data and not because of bad acting. I think they'll get more in trouble with Congress for, Russian collusion or from people, spamming or doing, different ad stuff. I think Google, on the other hand, based on shopping, Android, weird things like in France where they got shut down because they shut down Google News because they weren't going to pay for links to the publishers. I think Google, and especially now with the second data leak from Google Plus data, I think Google with their worldwide reach on search, advertising, Android, and just so many places, that just reminds me of when they went after Microsoft for being so embedded in so many different places. Google Home, voice search, they own Nest.
Dave, that's what I was going to say. Like I've just
There's
given
just
up.
so many places.
Well, no, I've just given up because I'm at the point now where I can think of something, not even saying it out loud, and I see an ad show up in Facebook for it. I'm not kidding you. Okay, not that bad, but you get the point.
Yeah.
Well, now, here in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission did an investigation of Google back in 2011, 2012, and obviously technology has changed since then. But at the time, the FTC looked at Google's search practices and got an agreement from Google that they would make certain changes about licensing certain standard essential patents and the like. But the FTC declined to take any other kinds of action, and specifically said that yes, we found that Google took aggressive actions to gain an advantage over search rivals, but did not bias the search results or otherwise hurt competition. So yeah, they were competing hard. Yes, they were being aggressive, but that those actions didn't add up to monopolization, didn't add up to bad acts. And while that was several years ago, it was the result of a bipartisan Federal Trade Commission, made up of, at the time, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So it's not like it was something that an act made by somebody who only liked big businesses, but instead it was just an application of antitrust law, and was not as controversial as you would have expected.
Which kind of brings up the interesting thing happening as we're recording this, that Google's CEO is up on the Capitol Hill testifying in front of Congress about the privacy alleged bias against conservative viewpoints, which, knowing what I know about Google's algorithm, which is like slim to none other than, what we learned from just being in general search optimization, is I honestly don't think that there's a bias in there, because when you go and search for something, you're going to get what Google thinks is the most appropriate result. Now, we've certainly seen where people have managed to spam certain topics and have gotten search results to be skewed slightly, but then Google, usually comes in and makes a correction, tweaks their algorithm or whatever in order to fix that. So, again, I'm kind of looking at it and say, yeah, they're dominant. Yes, they are huge, but are they really being that monopolist? Are they really taking that action? And honestly, again, you brought up the case from several years ago where they were found to not be doing that, and I think that'll happen again. Of course, I'm just Elmer. I'm certainly no expert in that in the legal sense, but yeah, it's just really fascinating to see that, and the different calls from groups of people, accusing Google of one thing or another, and what does that really look like? So this is all really fascinating from that academic viewpoint of just seeing what's really happening and how it really works.
What's fascinating for me, Elmer, is to see him not lose it when some of the questions that he has to answer, how he handles it so well. He's turned political. I would lose my mind at some of these questions people are asking. I'd be like, "Are you an idiot? How did you get elected to Congress?" Anyway.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that they prepared quite a bit, but but yeah, I can certainly see that. I haven't listened to any of it. I was going to wait and have a chance to kind of listen to it all at once, kind of digest it a little bit. But I've seen some comments on Twitter and Facebook, and yeah, I've heard that same comment from several people.
Well, guys, I really do appreciate you taking the time. And to our listeners, thanks for sticking with us a little bit longer than usual. This was a very important discussion, I feel. And so Elmer, Steve, any of you guys have any last minute words of wisdom or anything that you want to add to this before we say goodbye and sign off?
No, nothing further from me. I've really enjoyed the whole process, and happy to get on later on to as we see further developments. And I think the safest prediction is that we haven't heard the last of the antitrust issues regarding Google, Facebook, and some of these other tech companies.
Agreed.
I'd be happy to come on and talk about them a little further.
Very cool. We appreciate that. Elmer?
No, I just want to thank you both once again for letting Steve and I come in and talk with you all and to share knowledge with your audience. Appreciate it very much.
No problem at all. I appreciate it. Thanks to you too. And so for Elmer and Steve and Dave over there in cold Chicago, I'm Matt Siltala, and we appreciate everybody listening. And we're signing off for now. Thank you guys for joining us, and make sure and catch us on another one of these Business of Digital podcast episodes. So long.
Thanks all.
Thanks.